Welcome to the Scholars Chair. At Focus, the writings of educator Booker T. Washington. We shall explore his book entitled My Larger Education. Booker T. Washington wrote, "It has been my fortune to be associated all my life with a problem, a hard, perplexing, but important problem. There was a time when I looked upon this fact as a great misfortune. It seemed to me a great hardship that I was born poor, and it seemed an even greater hardship that I should be born a Negro. I did not like to admit, even to myself, that I felt this way about the matter, because it seemed to me an indication of weakness and cowardice for any man to complain about the condition of his birth. Later I came to the conclusion that it was not only weak and cowardly, but that it was a mistake to think of the matter in the way in which I had done. I came to see that, along with his disadvantages, the Negro in America had some advantages, and I made up my mind that opportunities that had been denied could be more than made up by greater concentration and power from within. Perhaps I can illustrate what I mean by a fact I learned while I was in school. I recall my teachers explaining to the class one day how it was that steam or any other form of energy, if allowed to escape and dissipate itself, loses its value as a motive power. Energy must be confined. Steam must be locked up in a boiler in order to generate power. The same thing seems to have been true in the case of the Negro, where the Negro had met with discriminations and with difficulties because of his race. He has invariably tended to get up more steam. When this steam had been rightly directed and controlled, it has become a great force for upbuilding of the race. If only the contrary, it merely spends itself in fruitless agitation and hot air, no good can come of it." Paradoxical as it may seem, the differences that the Negro has met since emancipation have, in my opinion, not always, but on the whole, helped him more than they have hindered him. For example, I think the progress which the Negro has made within less than half a century in the matter of learning to read and write the English language have been due in large part to the fact that in slavery this knowledge was forbidden him. My experience and observation have taught me that people who try to withhold the best things in civilization from any group of people or race of people not infrequently aid that people to the very things that they are trying to withhold from them. I am sure that in my own case, I should never have made the efforts that I did make in my early boyhood to get an education, and still later to develop the Tuskegee Institute of Alabama, if I had not been conscious of the fact that there were a large number of people in the world who did not believe that the Negro boy could learn, or that members of the Negro race could build up and conduct a large institution of learning. A wider acquaintance with men in all the different grades of life taught me that the Negro's case is not particular. The majority of successful men are persons who have had difficulties to overcome problems to master, and in overcoming these difficulties and mastering these problems, they have gained strength of mind and a clearness of vision that few persons have lived a life of ease have been able to obtain. Experience have taught me, in fact, that no man should be pitied because every day in his life he faces a hard, stubborn problem, but rather that it is the man who has no problem to solve, no hardship to face, who is to be pitied. His misfortune consists in the fact that he has nothing in his life which will strengthen and form his character, nothing to call out his latent powers and deepen and widen his hold on life. It has come home to me more in recent years than I have had, just because my life has been connected with a problem, some unusual opportunities. I have had unusual opportunities, for example, in getting an education in the broadest sense of the word. If I had not been born a slave, for example, I never could have had the opportunity, perhaps, of associating day by day with the most ignorant people so far as books are concerned, and thus coming in contact with people of this class at first hand. The most fortunate part of my early experience was that which gave me the opportunity of getting into direct contact and communing with and taking lessons from the old class of Negro folks who had been born slaves. At the present time, few experiences afford me more genuine pleasure than to get a day or half of a day off and go out into the country, miles from town, and railroad, and spend the time in close contact with a colored farmer and his family. And then I have felt for a long while that if I had not been a slave and lived on a slave plantation, I never would have had the opportunity to learn nature, to love the soil, to love cows and pigs and trees and flowers and birds and worms and creeping things. I have always been intensely fond of outdoor life. Perhaps the explanation for this lies partly in the fact that I was born nearly outdoors. I also, for my early childhood, been very fond of animals. I was but a child and a slave. I had close and interesting acquaintances with animals. I think that I owe a great deal of my present strength and ability to work to my love of outdoor life. It is true that the amount of time that I can spend in the open air is now very limited. Taken on an average, it is perhaps no more than an hour a day, but I make the most of that hour. In addition to this, I get more pleasure out of the anticipation and the planning for that hour. When I am at my home in Tuskegee, I usually find a way, by rising early in the morning, to spend at least a half an hour in my garden or with the farm animals. As far as I can get the time, I like to find the new eggs every morning myself. And when at home, I'm selfish enough to prevent no one else to do this in my place. As with growing plants, there's a sense of freshness and newness and of restfulness in connection with the finding and handling of newly laid eggs that is delightful to me. Both the anticipation and the realization are both pleasing. There are many interactions with farm animals, farm life, I could share with you. However, perhaps this will illustrate what I mean when I say I have gotten a large part of my education from actual contact with things, rather through the medium of books. I like to touch things and handle them. I like to watch plants grow and observe the behavior of animals. For the same reason, I like to deal with things as far as possible at first hand in the way that the carpenter deals with wood, the blacksmith with iron, and the farmer with the earth. I believe that there is something gained by getting acquainted in the way which I have described with the physical world around you that is almost indispensable. A number of years ago, in a book called Up from Slavery, I told a story of my early life, describing the manner in which I got my early schooling and the circumstances under which I came to start Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. At the time that school was organized, I had read very little and, in fact, very few books on the subject of teaching and knew very little about the science of education and pedagogy. I had had the advantage of going through an exceptional school at Hampton and on coming in contact with the inspired teacher in General Armstrong. But I had never attempted to formulate the methods of teaching I used in that school, and I had very little experience in applying them to the new and difficult problems I met as soon as I attempted to conduct a school of my own. What I learned about the science of education, I learned in my efforts in working out the plans for and organizing and perfecting the educational methods at Tuskegee. The necessity of collecting large sums of money every year to carry on the work at Tuskegee compelled me to travel much and brought me in contact with all kinds of people. As soon as I began to meet educated and cultivated people, people who had had the advantage of study in higher institutions of learning, as well as the advantages of much reading and travel, I soon became conscious of my own disadvantages. I found that the people I met were able to speak fluently and with perfect familiarity about a great many things with which I was acquainted in only a vague sort of way. In speaking, they use words and phrases from authors whom I have never read and often never heard of. All this made me feel more keenly my deficiencies, and the more I thought about it, the more it troubled and worried me. It made me feel all the more badly because I discovered that if I were to carry on the work I had undertaken to do, if I was ever going to accomplish any of the things that it seemed to me important to do, I should never find time, no matter how diligent and studious I might be, to overtake them and possess myself of the knowledge and familiarity of books for which I envy those people who have been more highly educated than myself. After a time, however, I found that while I was at a certain disadvantage among highly educated and cultivated people in certain directions, I had certain advantages over them in others. I found that the man that has the intimate acquaintance with some department of life through personal experience has a great advantage over persons who have gained their knowledge of life almost entirely through books. I found also that by using my personal experience and observation, by making use of the stories that I had heard as illustrations, by relating some incident that happened in my own case, or some incident that I had heard from someone else, I could frequently express what I had to say in a much more clearer and more impressive way than if I had used the language of books or statements or quotations from the authors of books. More than that, as I reflected upon the matter, I discovered that these authors, in their books, were after all merely making use of their own experiences or expressing ideas they have worked out in actual life, and that to make use of their language, and ideas were merely to get life secondhand. The result was that I made up my mind that I would try to make up for my defects in my knowledge of books by my knowledge of men and things. I said I would take living men and women for my study, and I would give the closest attention possible to everything that was going on in the world around me. I determined that I would get my education out of my work. I would learn about education and solving the problems of the school as they arose from day to day. I learned about life by learning to deal with men. I said to myself, I would try to learn something from every man I met. Make him my textbook, read him, study him, and learn something from him. So I began deliberately to try to learn from men. I learned something from big men and something from small men, something from men with prejudice and the man with prejudice. As I studied and understood them, I found that I began to like men better. Even those who treated me badly did not cause me to lose my temper or patience as soon as I found that I could learn something from them. For example, some years ago, I had an experience which taught me a lesson of politeness and liberty, which I shall long remember. I was in the large city making calls on wealthy people in order to interest them in our work at Tuskegee Institute. I called at the office of a man, and he spoke to me in the most insulting manner. He not only refused to give any money, but spoke of my race in a manner that no gentleman of culture ought to ever to permit himself to speak of another race. A few minutes later, I called on another gentleman in the same city who received me politely, thanked me for calling upon him, but explained that he was so situated that he could not help me. My interview with the first man occupied about twice as much of his time and my time as was true of the second gentleman. I learned from this experience that it takes no more time to be polite to everyone than it does to be rude. During the later years of my experience, I have had the good fortune to study not only white men and learn from them, but colored men as well. In my earlier experiences, I used to have sympathy with the colored people who were narrow and bitter towards white people. As I grew older, I began to study that class of colored people, and I found that they did not get anywhere, that their bitterness and narrowness towards the white man did not hurt the white man or change his feelings towards the colored race, but that in almost every case, the cherishing of such feelings towards the white man reacted upon the colored man and made him narrow and bitter. In the chapters which follows, I have given some account of the way in which my work has brought me in contact, not so much with plants and animals and with physical objects, but rather with people, human institutions, with politics, with newspapers, with educational and social problems of various kinds and descriptions, and I have tried to indicate in every case the way in which I have been educated through them. One of the purposes in writing these later chapters from my experience is to complete the story of my education, which I began in the book Up from Slavery, to answer the questions I have frequently been asked as to how I have worked out for myself the educational methods which we are now using at Tuskegee, and finally, to illustrate for the benefit of the members of my own race some of the ways in which a people who have or are struggling upward may turn disadvantages into opportunities, how they may gain within themselves something that will compensate them for what they have been deprived of from without. If I have learned much from things, I have learned more from men. The work that I started to do brought me early in contact with some of the most genius, high minded, and public spirited persons in the country. In the chapters that follow, I have tried to indicate what I have learned from contact with these men. Perhaps I can best indicate the way in which I have been educated by my contact with these men if I tell you something of my relations with one man from whom, after General Armstrong, my first teacher, I learned perhaps more than any other. I refer to the late William H. Baldwin, Jr. I well remember my first meeting with Mr. Baldwin, although the exact date has now slipped my memory. He was at the time manager and vice president of the Southern Railway, with headquarters in Washington, D.C. I had been given a letter to him by his father in Boston. I found him one morning in his office and presented this letter, which he read over carefully, as was his custom in such matters. Then we began talking about the school at Tuskegee and its work. I had been in the room but a few minutes when the conviction forced itself upon me that I had met a man who could thoroughly understand me and whom I understood. Indeed, I had the feeling that I was in the presence of one in whose mind there was neither flattering nor concealment, and one from whom it would be impossible to hide a single thought or purpose. I never had occasion, during all the years I knew Mr. Baldwin, to change the opinion formed of him at my first visit, and to feel that the understanding established between us then was ever clouded or diminished. Mr. Baldwin did not at first manifest any definite interest in the work at Tuskegee. He said he would come down and look it over, and if he found we were doing the real thing, as he expressed it, he would do anything he could to help. Within a few weeks after this first meeting, Mr. Baldwin fulfilled his promise to look us over and see if we were doing the real thing. He spent a busy day on the grounds of the institution, going through every department with the thoroughness of an experienced executive. He found, as a matter of course, a great many deficiencies in the details of the management and organization of the school, but he saw what the institution was striving to do and at once determined to help. In fact, from that time, he never lost an opportunity to serve the institution in every possible way. William H. Baldwin Jr. understood, as few men have, the Negro people, and understanding them as he did, he was in full sympathy with their ambition to rise to a position of usefulness as large and as honorable as that of any other race. Persons who knew him only slightly after hearing him express himself on the race question gained the impression that he was not in full sympathy with the deepest aspirations of the Negro people. But this impression was mistaken. He was, before all, anxious that the Negro people, in their struggle to go forward and succeed, should not mistake the appearance for the real thing. In his effort to have them avoid this danger, he sometimes seemed to go too far. But I would do injustice to the memory of Mr. Baldwin if, by anything I have written or said, I should leave the impression that, because he was interested in the welfare of the Negro, he was any the less interested in the progress of the white race in the South. He saw with perfect clearness that both races were, to a certain extent, dampened in their struggles upward by conditions which they had inherited and for which neither were totally responsible. He saw also that in the long run, the welfare of each was bound up with that of the other. Much as he did for Negro education, he never overlooked an opportunity to get money and secure support for the education of the unfortunate white people of the South. Mr. Baldwin's greatest service to Tuskegee Institute was in the reorganization of the finances of the institution. When he first became one of the trustees, the business organization of the school, its finances, and the system of keeping the accounts were in a very uncertain and unsatisfactory condition. He began at once to look into the investments and to study the items of our annual budget. The school was growing rapidly. The number of productive industries carried on by the school, the large amount of building we were engaged in, and the large amount of business carried on between the different departments made the accounts of the school particularly complicated, and the problem of the proper business organization a most important one. As I looked down over the years in which he and I worked together, it seems to me that the most pleasant and profitable hours I have ever known were spent with Mr. Baldwin in his library in Brooklyn, while we studied out together the problems and discussed the questions which this work involved. Among other things, I learned from Mr. Baldwin was that it is the smaller and petty things in life that divide people. It is the great task that brings men together. Any man who will take up his life in a broad spirit, not of class, nor sect, nor locality, but in the freer spirit which seeks to perform a work simply because it is good, and that man can have the support and the friendship of the best and the highest people in the world. As I have said before, I do not regret that I was born a slave. I was not sorry that I found myself part of a problem. On the contrary, that problem has given direction and meaning to my life and has brought me friendships and efforts and comforts that I could have gotten in no other way. Thank you for watching The Scholar's Chair. At focus was the writings of Booker T. Washington. We have been listening to his book entitled My Larger Education. See you next time in The Scholar's Chair.